Hola a los que se están conectando, ¿cómo están? Si se escucha, si se ve bien. Nada más estoy viendo si si Menno ya se va a conectar por acá. Igual denme un segundito y si no lo reiniciamos, ¿sale? Nada más estoy viendo eso todavía. ¿Cómo están? Hola, hola a todos. Déjenme ver si lo puedo hallar por acá. Voy a dar un par de minutitos para ver si me responde acá por Instagram. Y si no, reiniciamos, ¿sale? Ténganme poquita paciencia. Mientras los que se van conectando, ¿cómo están? Ya saben que es un poquito complicado luego con personas. Ahorita Menno me comentaba que iba a estar en Sao Paulo. Entonces, bueno, nada más estoy esperando que me responda. Para ya. No sé si me vaya a mandar la invitación y si no, yo se la mando. Pero es lo que estoy esperando. Y si se tarda ahorita mucho, reiniciamos, ¿sale? Nomás para tenerlos enterados. Ah, ya llegó. Déjenme le mando invitación. Y comenzamos.
No,
Hi, Menno.
tudo
Really
bem?
glad to see you. Really glad to see you, man. I'm really grateful for your time today. It's a huge honor and
My
a
pleasure.
pleasure.
So let's get into it.
Sure. So you're currently in Sao Paulo, right?
Yes,
Still
probably
on
going to
the
be here. Well,
digital nomad lifestyle, which is pretty cool, man.
more like the gypsy fleeing from one country to the next these days.
Still pretty cool. Well, I don't want to abuse your time, so let's get right into it. Today I ask you if we could talk about the diverse mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy and how our understanding of said mechanism has changed over the years. Because, well, if we go back to, let's say, pumping iron, and if we ask Arnold, maybe
Mhm.
we could talk about the pump. And then forward to, I think it was 2010, with the shuffle paper, the three mechanisms. And today, maybe all we can think about is mechanical tension. So, in regards to that, from a historical standpoint, how can we best approach our understanding of the mechanisms, Menno?
Sure. Yeah. I think I think one of the first things we can get into is speaking of digital nomadism. Is that I've lived in 51 countries from my
Yeah.
last recollection, and you can see that pretty much everywhere the bro training mentality. Like if you just get a lot of people that want to get jacked, if they train hard, they're serious. They pretty much all gravitate like from Asia to South America, Europe. Everywhere they gravitate towards the same sort of style of training, and that's partial range of motion training, um, technique not the best, typically somewhat higher, medium higher repetitions, relatively short rest intervals, a lot of things like drop sets, somewhat advanced training techniques, but a lot of stuff like supersets, drop sets. So I think the common denominator, if you look at those things, is that people train based on feel. So certain exercises, they just don't feel right. And other exercises, you really feel them very well. and partial range of motion, curls, mid-range movement, somewhat higher repetitions, you really feel the burn. And that's also what I think Schwarzenegger and people in that era, there wasn't much evidence-based fitness yet, so they mainly went by what they had, which is your training. Muscle growth is something you don't really observe. It takes a long time, and even then it's difficult to say what caused it. So what do you really know of what makes a workout a good workout? And if you don't have science to go by, it's basically just your feelings. So if you get sore the day after, that must be a good thing. Something's happening at least. And if you're in the workout itself, if you feel the burn, you feel the muscle that you're trying to work actually, give a response, that's an indication that something's happening. But of course, that something does not actually have to be muscle growth. It does not have to correlate with it. It does not have to be a sign of muscle growth. It may simply be a byproduct. And indeed, many of these things, like partial range of motion training, short rest intervals, lots of cardio, have actually been shown not only not to be beneficial, but actually to be outright detrimental for muscle growth. So that's definitely an era where people first, they just went by feel, and now we have a lot of scientific evidence to guide us rather than just having to go by our feelings.
Right, because the sensation of the training itself doesn't actually correlate with long-term adaptation. Let's say the pump, you feel huge, then you get home, and did that actually cause muscle growth? Did you really needed to go to failure on every set? That pump, is it actually the key driver of hypertrophy in the long term? And that's a really interesting point, because currently we all, myself included, we kind of go with the flag of evidence-based and science-based training and all this. But I think it's just a really important tool that we need to understand why we use it and how to best apply it. In regards to precisely muscle hypertrophy, it was, I don't know if it prior to that was another piece of research, but the 2010 paper by Schoenfeld, the 3 mechanisms. Can we begin by that, by mechanical tension? Can we begin defining what actually is mechanical tension and how, by all these processes of mechanosensors, mechanotransduction, how that actually increases muscle protein synthesis?
Yeah, so mechanical tension is a pathway of muscle growth, the mechanism that is by far the most established. And basically probably until the Schoenfeld paper, which was extremely popular. It's like, that's one of the most popular publications of all time, was like the true hallmark publication in evidence-based fitness. And Brad Schoenfeld in general has done so much for exercise science. It's, he revolutionized the field. It's no, you can't get around that. So at the time, I think those things made more sense, but the only thing that really had a lot of evidence was mechanical tension. And before that, mechanical tension was really the only popular one. Like in evidence-based fitness, or rather in exercise science, because there wasn't even that much evidence-based fitness yet. Mechanical tension was the thing that caused muscle growth. That's like, if you ask a scientist before the Schoenfeld publication, it was like mechanical tension.
Right.
And we have good mechanistic data from animals, from humans. The theory, a lot of evidence that if muscles produce high amounts of force, they generate tension. So it's good to realize that force production and tension are very closely related. In fact, they are intrinsically in the muscle almost the same, because the tension is what generates the force. So it's this high force production, this high tension, that causes a cascade of anabolic processes, starting with mechanotransduction, which is the translation of this mechanical tension to chemical activity. And that activates growth factors like IGF-1 that subsequently start a lot of chemical processes. And those basically end up being sensed by signaling pathways like mTOR. And that information from those growth factors and sensors of mechanical tension, which is mostly the integrins, and there's also research now indicating that titin is actually an important sensor of mechanical tension. This information is passed down to the genes, basically the nuclei. So most cells have like one cell core, and muscle cells are pretty unique in that they have many, many cell cores. And that's where your DNA resides, which has the blueprint, basically, to create new proteins. And there we see that in the ribosomes, protein synthesis is initiated. And we actually see the construction of new proteins, muscle proteins, in particular myofibrils and myofibrogenesis. So we actually have the whole process basically mapped out in pretty good detail, from the whole start of the mechanical tension, towards the signaling, towards the chemical activity, the growth pathways that are activated there, and the actual process of muscle growth, the protein synthesis, and subsequently the muscle growth that occurs after that. And we also have research, showing the things that these things all correlate. So, for example, the mTOR activation, typically, under normal circumstances, is a good indicator of protein synthesis. And protein synthesis over time is a good indicator of muscle hypertrophy.
Right. In regards to that, I think two key important points. One is mTOR. Some people begin to claim that maybe you can do a routine specific for activating mTOR, which is basically just saying like just increase the tension. And the other one, I think there was a sort of a misunderstanding that mechanical tension was only possible with high loads, that you needed to train heavy to induce mechanical tension, and that kind of aligned with the knowledge from old school bodybuilding that if you want to get big, you gotta lift heavy. But I think the current state of our understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, in regards to mechanical tension, is that a high load is not precisely the only way to get enough mechanical tension. If we go to another proposed mechanism, which had a mini mechanism to say something, was increased motor unit recruitment. So let's say I work with low loads, but until the point of very close to failure. But that doesn't mean that the metabolites produced in that process were the actual drivers of hypertrophy, but it was the recruitment of set fibers. Could you elaborate a little bit on that, Menno, please?
Yeah, I think the conundrum that we faced earlier is that at the end of a set, even with light weights, muscle activity levels are not that high. And I think the main thing that a lot of us didn't really couldn't get our head around is that we know that the size principle says that even with low loads, over time the bigger motor units with higher activation thresholds, they still kick in, they still help when there's enough fatigue, because fatigue lowers the recruitment threshold of higher threshold motor units. So the type 2 muscle fibers, the bigger motor units, which have more muscle fibers, and mostly type 2 muscle fibers, where most of the growth can take place. Most growth potential is in those motor units. They should activate, but if you look at muscle activity research, then anecdotally nobody did it, high reps. So if you look at muscle activity research, at the end of a set, you still see very low levels, relatively speaking, of muscle activity. And I think the conundrum there was that those motor units, they activate, but not all at the same time. So with a heavy weight, if you pick up a very heavy weight compared to, if you pick up 90% of 1RM instead of 60, from the very first rep, most of those motor units are going to be active. So muscle activity is going to be super high, and you have most motor units active at the same time, which creates very high muscle activity. But at the end of a set, with say 30 RM, you may over time stimulate all those motor units, but the big guys, they only kick in at the end. And by that time, other motor units have probably dropped out or at least decreased their firing rates. So the total level of muscle activity is not that high. And there may also, like very long sets in particular, there may be some recycling of motor units. So I think that was the main thing that a lot of people missed, is that they do activate, and that's the important thing. And that's also why they grow. Even at 30 RM or 30% of 1 RM, most research indeed indicates that you can get comparable growth on a set-by-set basis, provided you go close to failure, compared to a heavier set, 30% of 1 RM, 8 reps or something. So I think that was the thing that really confused a lot of people.
Yeah, because we used to think, myself included again, that in order to produce sufficient mechanical tension, well, you have to work with high loads. In order to go with the metabolic stress route For the metabolite training, well, you need to use light loads. But another important thing that you mentioned is the threshold of 30% 1RM. Because, okay, we can actually induce sufficient mechanical tension through light loads, but there is a threshold. Maybe if we go 10%, 20%, the slow twitch fibers can actually recover and continue with the activity.
Yeah, so there is most likely a threshold. Like if you look at research, below 30% of 1RM, it typically doesn't evoke the same muscle growth. And funny enough, even blood flow restriction training does not seem to change that threshold a whole lot. So it's still about 30% of 1RM. Now, you still get some growth with 15, 20%, but then you're mostly looking at elderly populations, novices in research, and it's typically not going to be the same as with 80% or even 30% of 1RM.
And the practical aspect of working with 30 reps, 40 reps is incredibly boring and incredibly, the first 30 something reps, what are those actually doing and how much time are you investing in those first 20 something reps? It's really not something that you can do in a common gym environment.
Yeah. Especially for some individuals, I had one study we did on deadlifts to check which powerlifters if they should deadlift sumo or conventional. We had one girl that even, I think at 60% of 1RM, that wasn't even 30. She did like 80 reps and then asked like, should I just keep going or?
Jesus Christ.
Like, yeah, some people, especially women, have to do crazy amount of reps.
She didn't throw up something after 80 reps of deadlifts?
It was basically cardio. Like just, you know.
Yes. Anything powerlifting up from 5 reps, just cardio. So again, with mechanical tension, well, we already established the definition, a new kind of understanding that we can not just induce sufficient tension with high loads, but also with low loads. But how to actually implement sufficient mechanical tension to elicit significant hypertrophy. And I think we can then, in this point, begin talking about volume and intensity.
Yeah, so intensity, you get basically this idea of the hypertrophy range has been considerably expanded, to say the least. Because I think the original idea mostly came from the idea of, heavy weights, good for strength, but you don't really feel it. So, maybe it's not good for muscle growth. And indeed, research does some studies, it's controversial, find that on a set-by-set basis, if you go above 5 RM, then one set may not stimulate the same amount of growth anymore as, say, 8 RM sets. And that's probably because of the lack of time under tension. So there is high tension, but it's so short that it may not be enough.
Right.
So then you need to add sets to get the same effect. But above 5 RM, you can go basically all the way up to about 30 RM. So that's the range of 85 to 30% of 1 RM. And you get roughly equivalent gains, at least in the short term, on a set-by-set basis, provided you go close to failure.
In regards to volume, the almighty volume, and I think last year it was a little more hot of a topic, but in regards to volume, how much can we actually implement to get sufficient tension? I mean, it's obviously a broad question. I know it's dependent on probably sex, the state of training, a lot of variables, but just a basic guideline.
Yeah, there's definitely an optimum range, which can vary quite a lot based on individual factors, I think. I think one of the big ones actually that we don't have that much research on, but in my experience, and at least one study on Ramadan fasting, seems to matter a lot to whether you're cutting or bulking.
Right.
So most studies on volume, especially the higher volume ones, they're on people that are either in maintenance or some energy surplus. And I think those volumes, they're not going to work if someone's in contest prep in significant energy deficit. People cannot recover from that anymore. And also some studies showing benefits all the way up to like 45 sets per muscle. Typically, they use shorter rest intervals. So, one set, if you're doing, say, 10 sets of squats, for example, that last set is going to be either just low quality or you're not going to be able to do a lot of repetitions. 10 sets, especially with short rest interval, at say 8 RM. A lot of people, if they really do that, they probably manage, 2 reps, 3 reps, that last set. So that's not a lot of actual volume.
Right.
And if you look at studies that are more practical, I would say, then you're typically looking at a range of like 10 to 30 sets for maximum hypertrophy per muscle group per week. So work sets. And it's quite a range. Research generally indicates beginners quickly reach a ceiling effect. So you see this in quite some research on different topics. That if you get an untrained individual to do something, they will grow, and it's not that hard to maximize growth. In fact, if you look at molecular signaling pathways, and one meta-analysis actually found that in a rank untrained individual, having them do cardio, just bicycle riding, for example, is basically already going to maximize growth for at least like the first couple weeks. So they don't even need to do strength training. They can just,
Right.
anything is better than nothing. If you're used to absolutely nothing, then just any stimulus on your muscles is pretty much going to cause growth. But as you get more advanced, you need actual strength training, high intensity, closer to failure, and get to that 10 to 30 range, typically over 10, I'd say. But high inter-individual variability, because you said sex may play a role, women may tolerate higher volumes, at least in terms of recovery capacity and amount of repetitions. I think energy intake is a big one, just overall recovery capacity and sleep, stress, body fat percentage. Like those things have all been shown to affect recovery capacity. And the only reason that high volumes at some point become excessive is likely because they exceed recovery capacity. So unless you're actually talking about, like there was a rat study where they actually found that if you have rats do obscene amount of volume, at some point you basically plateau on protein synthesis and protein breakdown levels keep increasing further. So it's actually possible that at that point you get junk volume because you're accumulating basically just muscle damage and the growth stimulus has already plateaued.
We will be talking about the inverted view, right? That more volume is better if you can recover from said volume. And in regards to that, do you use or still use the volume landmarks, the Mike Israel volume landmarks? I think they were really, really useful, at least just as a tool to understand that maybe you can do too little, enough, and maybe too much. But actually propose numbers to say MEV is this for most people, MRV is this for some people. I think that's where many people drew the line. Do you use tools like this, Menno?
Yeah, I mean, I like the terms. Conceptual framework to see, like, to illustrate the concept. There is something like a minimum effective volume. Like there is just a certain amount of training that you have to do to get any results. And I think for quite some people, especially advanced trainees, that's actually higher than they think. And there's also research showing that non-responders to exercise, so people that basically seem to have no positive response to exercise, they don't gain muscle, they don't gain strength, they don't get faster for running, for example, that if they increase their volume, they do become responders. And in a few analyses of studies, you also see that the number of non-responders is typically smaller in the higher volume groups. So it may be that, it's not like, which used to be the line of thought, that they're just genetically screwed. They're hard gainers, they're not going to gain any muscle, doesn't matter what. But it's probably the case that for those individuals specifically, they probably need more volume. It's also possible they need less, because there have been at least one study last year, or even the year before that now, 2018 maybe, where they found that, interestingly, in the same person, so they had the different legs subject to a medium versus high volume, for example, and they found that some people respond better to high, some people better to low. Now, the overall trend, if you take the entire population, someone's not making any gains, do you tell them to go up or down? Like typically, they probably need to go up, but it is actually possible that some people have a really low optimum effect volume, and they may, gravitate towards the HIIT crowds and those kind of programs because they just burn out when they do more.
By the way, Menno, I think a really cool idea for a team, production of t-shirts would be genetically screwed team. I'm from the genetically screwed. So, well, that kind of that kind of says it all. If you don't get great results, I'm gonna steal the term if you don't mind. So very well, man.
Sure.
I think that covers the important stuff from mechanical tension. Can we move on to metabolic stress? And first, like we did with like you did with mechanical tension, can we define what is actually metabolic stress and how which metabolites would be a little more relevant or less relevant than we thought before and now in regards to signaling hypertrophy?
So that's actually immediately the first point about metabolic stress, I would say, is that it doesn't really have a scientific definition. So first there was the idea of the pump and the burn. And this was basically, I think, I dare say rationalized, reconceptualized into metabolic stress. But it never really had a proper definition. It wasn't quantified. You can't say like, you know, X units of metabolic stress. It was more like a catch-all term for lactate, hydrogen ion accumulation, and oxygen deprivation, hypoxia, and associated metabolic byproducts, I think. Something like that was the closest thing to a definition. So now we actually also know that things like lactate don't actually cause fatigue, so they're probably not really metabolically stressful in that sense. They just correlate with it. So it's already dubious in that account, like which metabolic byproducts you actually want to look at. But the main thing is that, you know, it was more a general intuition or a more formal attempt to say the pump and the burn, you know? So if someone has, if you get a good pump and a good burn in your muscles, you can probably say that probably the most people's intuition is more like, oh, that is high metabolic stress. And there has been some support for metabolic stress in terms of growth, mostly from in vitro cells. Like if you cell swelling, for example, seems if you get an isolated cell in the lab, it seems to get some sort of an anabolic signal when it swells and when it experiences metabolic stress. But in humans, in the complex array of actual, you know, functioning muscles in a human body, there's never been much support for it. Like the closest thing was basically blood flow restriction training. We now also know that that's probably also just caused by mechanical tension, making your muscles work harder and lowering the recruitment threshold of high threshold motor units, because it can actually also work in other body parts. Like if you occlude your arms, it may actually increase muscle growth in your pecs. And if you include your legs during squats, it can increase muscle growth in your glutes. So it's just the fact that you have to work harder, not the fact that inherently that hypoxia or the metabolic stress in that particular muscle is causing the growth. Some research has also indicated that, especially post-workout, if you occlude your muscles, and if you keep them occluded in between sets, that may actually reduce muscle growth. In part, possibly because it simply lowers how much active work your muscles can do, just too much fatigue for no gain. So if you also look at a lot of scenarios that stimulate a lot of metabolic stress, they typically don't stimulate much muscle growth. Like high-intensity interval training, like sprinting, hill sprints, they induce a whole lot of metabolic stress. Also satellite cell activity, if we're going to talk about muscle damage later. And don't cause much growth. In fact, interval training in general is massively overestimated in terms of muscle growth. It's pretty much, especially after the first few runs, if your rest intervals are short, it's really not training like a sprinter. You're training like a soccer player, and you're probably going to look like a soccer player if that's the main training that you do. Like sprinters is maybe 10 seconds of sprinting, and then 4 minutes of rest, and they do a whole lot of strength training and stuff that mainly gets them jacked, not the sprinting. So I love those scenarios where you see high metabolic stress, you don't see much muscle growth, short rested periods. Actually, I co-authored with Brad Schoenfeld the first big review, I'd say, that shifted the paradigm on rest intervals. Before that, the dominant thought was that short rest intervals were beneficial for growth. And in that review I showed they may actually be detrimental. They're certainly not positive. Because that whole idea of hormones and metabolic stress, it doesn't seem to lead to muscle growth. And in fact, it seems to be that longer rest intervals, and now doesn't seem to be, it's quite conclusive, I'd say at this point, that longer rest intervals actually result in more growth because you can do more work. And more work means more mechanical tension on your muscle fibers. So I think pretty much all lines of research that were even thought to imply that metabolic stress was good for muscle growth have pretty much dried up, and many have even shown to be detrimental rather than positive.
Right. Because lactate in specific, well, our understanding of lactate and beforehand lactic acid, it's changed quite a bit. And it's not like lactate per se, it's causing any stress. It's like you said, the hydrogen ions. But even then, can we actually correlate those two, and whether it's lactate or the ions, with actual extra growth besides mechanical tension? Let's say, okay, we have all the signaling that goes on from the tension, but are those metabolites actually contributing something, or they're just happening to keep us during the activity to produce sufficient energy?
Yeah, it's more metabolic probably. Even hydrogen ion accumulation doesn't seem to actually cause that much fatigue. In recent research, it may be one of the factors, or it may interact with some factors. There's now some looking into potassium and calcium and some other things. But regardless of what really causes the fatigue, lactate does correlate with metabolic stress, because basically it correlates very well with all types of activity that rely on a lot of energy production from glucose.
Right.
Now, the lactate itself actually consumes proton ions, so it should actually buffer against at least acidification from hydrogen ion accumulation, and it's definitely not a cause of fatigue. But it does correlate well with it, because if it correlates with energy production from glucose, it correlates basically with total work output over a certain threshold of intensity, and that's at least a proxy for how much effort your muscles have to do. So it still doesn't correlate with the exact amount of muscle growth, I think, in research. If you look at research, for example, from rest intervals, you again see that you cannot correlate the amount of muscle growth directly. It's somewhat of a proxy for it.
But not something like we need to program for, like let's say metabolite training, like some people call it. Is this actually a real term we can use, metabolite training, or maybe we can just refer to low training and high rep training to further stimulate more muscle fibers? Is it actually correct to say metabolite training in regards to hypertrophy?
You can call it that, but I think it's not. It's missing the actual pathway via which it works, because, like we discussed, it's still the mechanical tension of those. When you do low rep training, it's still mechanical tension that drives muscle growth. So it's a type of training that causes high metabolic stress, but that's just a byproduct. It's not the reason that
right.
You call it metabolite training. It's like you are implying that you're doing it for the metabolite buildup, but you should do it for the metabolic stress, and the metabolic for the mechanical tension, and the metabolic stress is just a byproduct that comes along with it. In fact, there are good reasons to do some high rep training, which may include preferential type 1 fiber activation. And there was a Russian study that found that even between, I think, 7 and 16 RM or something, in very, very advanced lifters, you could see that different anabolic pathways were activated. So that may suggest that if you do both, maybe in different sessions or in the same session, they can complement each other and maybe drive more total growth. So there are some indications that it may be good to do both, but it's not because of metabolic stress.
Right. And one final note in regards to metabolic stress, the cell swelling. I think we can understand cell swelling just as passive tension. If the cell is expanding, maybe these mechanosensors can actually begin all these signaling processes, not because of the swelling itself, but because of the expansion, the tension perceived. Is this a correct assumption, or missing something there in regards to cell swelling?
That's possible, yeah. I mean, cell swelling hasn't been found to cause muscle growth very directly in living humans. So, but if it does, it could just be mediated by mechanical tension. It would have to be it would depend on where the swelling is, because the mechanical tension is sensed mainly at the muscle tendon junction and in tighten. So it would somehow have to press on those areas, although there's still a lot of uncertainty about how the mechanical tension really is sensed exactly. So, but it's possible, yeah.
Right. I was missing a little extra point in regards to metabolic stress. The reactive oxygen species, which I think maybe it's not that interesting, but I think some people used to claim that maybe they could contribute for hypertrophy, but can we say that actually?
I wouldn't say there's any strong evidence for it.
Right.
If anything, it can cause inflammation, and we know excess inflammation is bad for muscle, but some is probably necessary. So, in general, research finds that with inflammation, which ROS production is correlated with, then it seems that there is probably going to be some anyway when there's muscle growth, and but you don't want an excess of it. So probably it's one of those things that just happens, and you don't have to target it, but you also don't have to fight it.
It sounds kind of fancy if you say, "Oh, I'm training for reactive oxygen, cell swelling, and all that."
Exactly. That's, I think, many of those things are people that you still just go by your intuitions, like the pump and the burn and everything, and then you rationalize it or give it a cool term. In fact, almost all bro science, if you look at it, like all pseudoscience, is basically you take a given assumption, something that feels right or just is plausible, and then you name some, especially with fancy terms, ideally, some mechanism that is very simple and pretty linear. Like this causes this, like mTOR. It activates mTOR, and mTOR causes muscle growth.
Right.
But and then it can catch on, because like in one sentence, you can basically say to some bro in the gym, like, yeah, I'm doing this, why? It stimulates mTOR. mTOR is good for muscle growth. But if it becomes more complex, it typically doesn't catch on. And if it's something like research on this is controversial, that certainly won't catch on, because people want certainty.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. They want something simple, but still somewhat fancy sounding, and then it has, it may become a hype.
Very well, Menno. So the last one, the black sheep of the mechanisms, muscle damage. I mean, we now have the DAMA studies, the related DAMA studies, but why was it actually thought initially that muscle damage would be a mechanism for hypertrophy?
Yeah, again, it was mostly cells outside the lab. And there were two arguments, I think two big arguments for muscle damage. One is satellite cell activity, but we actually know now that muscle growth can, so basically the idea is that when muscle grows, there's satellite cell activity, typically that corresponds with that. And that's also the satellite cells, they donate their cell core, which then is taken up by muscle fibers. So you get myonuclear addition. You get more of those cell cores, myonuclei, in muscle fibers. And that's part of the process of muscle growth, because a muscle size is limited to an extent by its number of cell cores, because every cell core, every nucleus can only govern, it's like a command center, it can only govern a certain region of muscle. So if you want to make the muscle a lot bigger, you need some additional cell cores. In that sense, satellite cell activity is somewhat necessary for long-term muscle growth. And we know that muscle damage can, or corresponds with, high satellite cell activity. But we now know, we have research showing that if you, in rodents, for example, you inhibit satellite cell activity, you can still gain muscle. And as long as you're not over your myonuclear domain, in humans also we see that there can be considerable muscle growth without further myonuclear addition. And there's also no strong correlation between satellite cell activity and muscle growth. So that's the line of research that, in general, most research indicates that the satellite cell activity isn't really there for net muscle growth, but more for repair. So that's why you see a lot of it with muscle damage. And you also see a lot of satellite cell activities with certain injuries, for example, that don't cause muscle growth. So most research indicates that the muscle damage in that regard is more there for repair. The muscle damage signals the need for repair, which makes sense, but not actual growth. And like a good study by Damas et al. also found directly that muscle damage inflicts or causes a lot of protein breakdown, and any associated protein synthesis that comes with that is just there for the repair. So there's high protein turnover, but there is not a net increase in protein synthesis. Like any of the anabolic events that take place for muscle damage are there to repair that muscle damage. So it seems like, it stimulates anabolic events, but those are there to repair the damage that you did. So it's not actually a net growth stimulus.
Until the repair is done, then you can talk about hypertrophy, right? Precisely the
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So that was one main avenue, basically, of an argument, like satellite cell activity. And the other argument for muscle damage as a driving factor for muscle hypertrophy was eccentric only training.
Right.
So if you compare a given set of only eccentric, so that's like you're only lowering the weight. Typically you do that with special machines so that you don't have to lift it and you only have to resist the descent. The muscle is lengthening under contraction but not shortening, formally speaking. That type of training results in more muscle growth on a set-by-set basis, typically, than concentric training, so where you're only lifting the weight. However, if you're equating total work, then the difference becomes marginal or non-existent, which suggests that it's the total work, the extra work that you do, that signals muscle growth, which is, again, comes down to mechanical tension, not the inherent, the muscle damage that comes with eccentric training. Because that's what the idea, like eccentric training stimulates more muscle growth, it stimulates more muscle damage. Well, maybe those things correlate, that's the reason. But then we see, well, actually, if you equate for the total work, it's pretty much the same. And there's now also research, just a few months ago, there was a study that actually suggested that eccentric training doesn't even stimulate more muscle damage to begin with. It's just that nobody does eccentric training. So it's going to be a novel stimulus. And a novel stimulus induces a lot of muscle damage. And that study found that after, say, 10 weeks or so on a given program, the extra muscle damage disappeared. So it may not even be the case that eccentric training is more muscle damaging, or that it's more muscle growth stimulating. So neither of the arguments basically seem to hold. It's just that eccentric training allows you to do more work because you're stronger eccentrically than concentrically, which is because of the actin myosin cross bridges that create muscle contractions are basically cleaved mechanically. Basically, when you flex, that occurs by actin myosin cross bridges, which have to contract into each other, and that costs energy, and it takes work for your body to do that. But when the muscle is lengthening, those cross bridges are basically cleaved, taken apart, somewhat mechanically, because the weight is basically forcing your muscle into a stretch. So you're naturally stronger when lowering a weight than when lifting it. And that's not just, you can lower more than you can lift. It's actually the muscle is producing more force because of that, the way it's designed. So all in all, these arguments for muscle damage as a driving factor for muscle growth have pretty much evaporated. And we now see in research in various studies that muscle growth and muscle damage do not correlate. And if they don't correlate, it's very hard to see how one would cause the other. That's very rare in general in just sciences. And you also see studies where, for example, things that induce a lot of muscle damage, like eccentric training, or induce a lot of satellite cell activity, like again, interval training. Those things don't really, they aren't uniquely beneficial for muscle growth. So all in all, it's one of those things where if you look at the totality of research, I'd say that you actually want to avoid excess muscle damage because we know it prolongs recovery. We know that damaged muscles have poor motor learning and cannot activate to the same extent. So muscle activity can be compromised by high levels of muscle damage. And we also know that it can increase protein breakdown, but not net synthesis. So we have a lot of research indicating that just, also the logical thought that a lot of damage to your muscles impairs recovery. But if it doesn't increase muscle growth, then the stimulus to fatigue ratio of that is really poor. And we don't see that much in research yet, but that's because we don't have a lot of research where people are pushing their volume to their limits. Just like with training to failure, we don't see that it's or certain advanced training techniques, we don't see that they reduce muscle growth. But I think that's because they're just not pushing the trainees hard enough to begin with to show that these things become detrimental. When you're, if you're doing that with 30 sets a week, it's going to be a different story than when you do it with 5 sets a week.
I think in regards to muscle damage, actually, with this understanding and this very comprehensive review that you just gave, which was awesome, by the way, we can understand why begin a cycle of training from low to high, let's say low stimuli, and progressively increase the stimuli, because we don't actually want to increase the muscle damage, because that would blunt the hypertrophy signaling. And can we talk just a little bit before we finish this conversation about the
mechanism
protective effect? I'm sorry?
Okay, go on. Protective effect of?
I lost the term. How your body protects from repeated bout effect. Yeah, that's the one. Right. I had it in Spanish, but I was like, repeated bout effect. Can we talk just a little bit of that, Menno, please?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, the repeated bout effect is basically the phenomenon that muscle becomes less sensitive to damage, or at least to delayed onset muscle soreness, so muscle soreness, DOMS, with repeated exposure. And like I said, if you do you have any novel stimulus, if you do a new exercise, try split squats for the first time, for example, or try just increasing your volume, you just double your normal volume. Those things almost certainly make you sore. Like when I go surfing, which is not often, but I like to do it sometimes, I'm super sore afterwards. Snowboarding, same scenario. Like you get crazy sore from those things where you think, I do heavy deadlifts and everything. I do way more stressful stuff for my muscles on a daily basis. And I stand on a snowboard or a surfboard for a couple minutes and I'm sore. Right? How does that make sense? That's because soreness is in large part actually a neural phenomenon. You can sort of say that muscle soreness is a type of muscle damage that you experience a lot in pain. So it's not, muscle soreness and muscle damage don't actually correlate that well. In many scenarios, they don't correlate. But you can say that soreness is something you feel more. And the repeated bout effect is in part neural, but in part also an actual reduction in muscle damage. Like the muscle sort of becomes used to that type of stimulus and knows how to adapt to it and recover from it. And it also doesn't evoke the same amount of pain anymore. That's why if you stick with a certain program over time, you get very sore typically the first week, maybe second week, and then over time it typically reduces to the point that some individuals, like me, are actually basically never sore if you do exercise that you're used to. Now, that can actually be an argument to not have too much variation in your training, which also a study by Demas sort of found is that if you have a lot of variation in your training, with advanced training techniques and some other exercises, you induce more muscle damage, but not more growth. So if you're pushing your volume up and everything, then probably you can't handle the same amount of training anymore. So it can actually be beneficial to stick with a certain program for longer periods rather than you continuously change it up, because you actually want your body to adapt to that and not to be super sore and damaged every time you work out.
Right, which is a really strong case from not going from program to program, because you actually need to adapt. It's not like you're avoiding the adaptation, because, well, what's the point of training then, right?
Yeah. The thing with muscle confusion, which I often call muscle confusion, the people say, well, yeah, if you work with the same program, or I don't want my body to adapt. It's like adaptation is the very goal. Like muscle growth is an adaptation. Strength increases are an adaptation. So you want your body to adapt to the program. That's exactly the very goal of the training.
Very well, Menno. So I want to be super respectful of your time. It's been a really comprehensive chat about the diverse mechanism and how our understanding has been changing through the years and through scientific advances. So without further much to add, I really want to thank you. It's been a huge honor, Menno. I hope we can do this again sometime soon, and I hope you have a really good rest of the day. So thanks again, Menno. It's been a huge pleasure.
My pleasure. And maybe see you soon.
See you soon, Menno.
See ya. Wait.
Just give me a sec. All right.